Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. In just over a week, India will celebrate 75 years of independence. And that raises the critical question, what does this anniversary mean? Have we been loyal and truthful to the ideals of our constitution, or have we often turned our back on them and even sometimes betrayed them? Or to put it differently, what are the achievements we can be truly proud of? What are the errors and lapses that have embarrassed us? Today we present the first of a series of reflections on India at 75. And my first guest is the author, historian and Congress MP, Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor, as India celebrates 75 years of independence, if a man from Mars were to say to you, what sort of country is India, what would be your answer?
It would rather depend if the Martian was a prospective tourist or an inquisitive journalist, the Martian Karan Thapar. I think if you were a tourist, I'd talk about the extraordinary place that India is, the land of snow peaks and tropical jungles of beaches and rivers and deserts, of people of this most astonishing variety, a land of multiple languages, 35 languages spoken by more than 1 million people each, all of these wonderful things that make India such a special place to discover. And I'd celebrate the history, the diversity, the plural character of India. Now, if the fellow were a journalist, I'd probably talk about India as being in many ways at the cusp of some of the more exciting adventures facing the world at the third decade of the 21st century. Are we going to be able, for example, to develop our people, get people who currently have no access even to electricity right into the 21st century? Are we going to be able to make sure that every Indian, and that's 1.4 billion of us, and we're soon going to be the most populous nation on earth, are we going to be able to get them into the kind of decent life that enables everyone 3 square meals a day, better prospects for their children, all of that? So many of these questions are yet to be resolved. And there is a process. We are engaged in an adventure, a challenging adventure of transformation. And at the same time, I talk about the fact that we're going through some major challenges politically as well. We are in many ways a democracy that's in a fundamental process of questioning itself as a democracy. And these are the issues that I would probably address to a journalist. Otherwise, I might sort of plagiarize myself and talk about India as a land of 4 different systems of classical dance and 300 ways of cooking the potato.
You're talking about the challenges India faces. Let me start with perhaps the greatest challenge it faced in 1947. Many people believed that the country might not survive as a united country. We faced divisions of caste, creed, ethnicity, cuisine, language, and even culture. How successfully, 75 years later, have we crafted an all-Indian identity that everyone can subscribe to?
We have and we haven't. And you're quite right, by the way, it's not just in 47, right up to 67. I remember the then London Times correspondent Neville Maxwell confidently writing before the 67 elections that this would be India's last election. There wouldn't be an India, there wouldn't be a democracy, there'd be no more elections. That was the sort of attitude that many people had. There were books in the 50s talking about India's imminent disintegration. We proved them all wrong, and that is one of our greatest triumphs. But when you say, have we created a purely Indian identity, as I say, yes and no. When you go to any cricket match featuring India and you see the Indian identity on full-scale display, But you go to any election and you see a great willingness to subdivide that Indian identity into Hindu versus Muslim, into Yadav versus Brahmin, into Bodo versus Bengali migrant, into Dalit or Adivasi versus caste Hindu, etc., etc. And that is actually in many ways something that some of our founding fathers thought would never happen. I mean, Nehru, for example, actually believed the caste system and caste consciousness would disappear. And he assumed that we would be able, through our democracy, to forge a truly pan-Indian identity where these distinctions wouldn't matter. But he got it wrong, ironically, because democracy underscored the value of these sub-identities as politicians began to mobilize voter support on the basis of these identities. So I'd say, yes, we do have, every time we have a war, we had Kargil most recently, I suppose, if you want to think of it as a conflict, or we have something like the Pulwama terrorist attack, or we have a cricket match.
Absolutely.
When we have those, there is India, there's Indianness, we're all Indians first. But the rest of the time, I'm afraid we very often divide ourselves into other allegiances first.
Look back over the 75 years for me and tell me, what are the achievements we as a country can be truly proud of?
Oh, there's plenty, Kar. I mean, first of all, don't forget the condition in which the British left us in 1947. I mean, they had drained this country of every worthwhile resource for 200 years. We had a literacy rate of 16%. It was 8% for women, by the way, at that point. We had a life expectancy of 27, the worst maternal and infant mortality in the world. This was a country that had become a poster child for poverty, famine, pestilence, disease, suffering, and illiteracy. There was almost nothing going for us, and the British were happy to get rid of us. And then what did? We managed to transform all of those figures. We have a life expectancy now of 70, not of 27. We have a literacy rate of almost 80, in fact higher than 80 for men, slightly lower than that for women, instead of the 16 and 8 we talked about. We have dramatically improved on almost all the human development indicators, including maternal and child mortality, malnutrition. We still have problems. I don't want to pretend that we've eliminated all of them. There still is poverty. There still is malnutrition in some parts of our country, particularly amongst, for example, the Adivasi people and so on. But the kind of progress we have made, given where we were, has been nothing short of astonishing.
What about the opposite? What are the errors, the lapses, even the willful mistakes that have most embarrassed us?
Well, you could turn the same things around and say, well, a country like Sri Lanka, for example, managed to reach almost 100% literacy much earlier than us. We have a couple of states like Kerala, which are out there, but the country as a whole still hasn't got there. And we can talk about the fact that, say, a state like Gujarat has magnificent GDP growth figures and still has some of the worst figures for child malnutrition in the country. So how do you manage to reconcile the fact that so much of what's good about India seems to be immediately offset about what's bad about India, and often about the same place? So that's a problem.
So you're saying whatever is good can also be seen as bad?
Well, no, not entirely. I don't think you can really turn around and say that something something like improving literacy or child mortality is bad, but you can say it wasn't good enough. We could have done better. That's one argument. The second thing is the perception that perhaps we didn't do enough to take advantage of the opportunities that were available economically from the world markets in the 50s and 60s. Because, at that point, our nationalist leaders were so suspicious. After the East India Company had come to trade and stayed on to rule, our nationalist leaders all were suspicious of every foreigner with a briefcase, seeing him as the thin end of a neo-imperial wedge. And so they all thought that the only way they could guarantee the political independence they'd fought so long and so hard for was to give India economic independence. And the economy of self-reliance, unfortunately, meant we spent about 45 years regulating stagnation, subsidizing unproductivity, and distributing poverty.
Are you talking about what the Congress called the socialistic pattern of society, the
That's
Avadi
right.
Resolution?
That's right. So there were many good things in the socialistic pattern of society that we couldn't have done without it. In other words, the creation, for example, of the scientific and industrial base in India, which didn't really exist before that. But there were many opportunities we missed as well. And that's why I said with India, everything you talk about, the opposite is also true. You say this is a good thing, and you say, what? We could have done that. and you say, yes, economic opportunities were missed. At the same time, there were things done that didn't exist before. And certainly the establishment of the scientific establishment in India, the 5 IITs that Nehru established, for example, that technological basis that gave us now one of the world's most advanced rocket and satellite programs, which Nehru believed in, and which obviously everyone thought that a poor developing country like India couldn't do. All of that, those are successes that came out of the same state-controlled, statist system that I'm decrying when it comes to economic opportunities. And then there's the China war. There's no getting away from that.
Let's take those one by one. Let me interrupt you there, because one of the things this Martian visiting will have noticed is that politics often dominates the domestic public discourse in India. So let me ask you this. How much does the world's largest democracy, something we're terribly proud of calling ourselves, owe to India's first Prime Minister? How much of our democracy is the result of his personal attitude and commitment to Parliament, to opposition opinion, and to ensuring that the procedure was correct?
Absolutely everything. In other words, without Nehru, we might not have remained a democracy. And indeed, Nehru could have taken India in an undemocratic direction, because with Mahatma Gandhi's assassination in 1948 and Sardar Patel's death in 1950, he was completely unchallengeable. There was nobody with a fraction of the stature he had in the country. And if he said, as Nkrumah in Ghana or Nyerere in Tanzania did, that I am a nationalist democratic hero, but to direct development and to keep the country united, I'm going to have to suspend all these democratic things and rule with an authoritarian hand, he could have got away with it. But he didn't. In fact, he went the other way. For example, I love telling the story because everyone knows Nehru occasionally had a short temper. He once made an intemperate remark about a judge. Within a very short while, he had written a groveling letter of apology to the judge, and then a letter to the Chief Justice apologizing for having insulted the judiciary inadvertently. Now, he didn't need to do that. No one was expecting it of him. He was the most powerful man in the country. But he wanted to convey that the respect for institutions was far, far greater than the authority of an individual, even an elected one. And, you know, he's quite remarkable that he authored a famous anonymous attack upon himself, even before independence in the Modern Review.
1936.
1936, when he wrote an article, no, 1938, after the elections of 37, when he'd actually got all these crowds.
Compared himself to Caesar.
He said, we want no Caesars.
Absolutely.
And that was the message.
Tell me this. Are you saying, because it sounds like it, that India wouldn't be a democracy today if Nehru hadn't been the first Prime Minister?
Might not have been, is all I said, because you can never know, it's all counterfactual. But Nehru did a number of things to shore up respect for democracy. He attended Parliament rigorously himself and obliged his cabinet to do so, obliged his senior officials to do so. He responded patiently to every criticism and encouraged criticism even from his own party backbenchers. And at one point, a Congress minister resigned because of an attack upon him by his own party's backbencher, the famous T.T. Krishnamachari resignation under withering fire from Feroz Gandhi. So you've got example after example of people feeling empowered by Nehru to attack them. There's a famous story of Vajpayee as a young, brash politician in his 30s, delivering a scathing attack on Nehru, and then Nehru meeting him in the lobby as he comes out saying, "That was a brilliant speech, young man, you will go far." I mean, this sort of thing, I have to say, is something we cannot imagine today from the comparable figures, shall we say, of our era.
But Nehru was also Prime Minister during the Indo-China War of 1962. You were starting to talk about that. I stopped you at that point. Let me bring it up now. It resulted in a defeat that has haunted India for 60 years, and let's be honest, it continues to haunt us today. How much of the blame and responsibility for mishandling the relationship with China rests squarely with Jawaharlal Nehru?
You know, as an admirer of Nehru, I'm willing to admit that he does carry an enormously large portion of the blame. He had a magnificent sense of human civilization history, and he saw India and China as fellow Asian civilizations, great civilizations that had been essentially oppressed by Western powers. And he saw their rise from a very young age. This was a vision of his, saw their rise as basically going to narrate the story of the second half of the century. And so he was very friendly with China, whether it was under Chiang Kai-shek first or later under Mao Zedong. He wanted good relations with China. He went out of his way to help the Chinese. For example, when the Chinese delegation was coming to the Afro-Asian Summit in Bandung,
but what about my point? How
we sent a plane to them to come and bring them over. So in the process, his illusions about China, I'm afraid, blinkered him to some of the reality of the Chinese state, the communist system, and the imperial ambitions that lurked behind the communist facade.
His illusions blinkered him.
I'm afraid so. On this particular issue, there's very little doubt about it. There's a famous letter from Sardar Patel in 1950, before he died, obviously, saying to Nehru in some detail what his concerns were about China and Chinese intentions, and recommending a course of action, which is exactly the opposite of what Nehru went for. And there's also no doubt that in the course of the 50s, we took no steps to prepare ourselves for a possible Chinese threat. And I say possible because you don't, the old cliche about if you don't want war, prepare. I mean, if you want peace, prepare for war. We didn't prepare for war. We were actually downsizing our army.
And a lot of the responsibility vests with Nehru.
Of course it does. He was the prime minister. And I might add, he was de facto, he was the foreign minister as well.
He was foreign minister, not just he was actually foreign minister.
That's right.
What about the emergency? How much of a blot on India's democratic credentials was the emergency of 1975? And at the same time, let me ask you, to what extent did Indira Gandhi atone for it by holding elections, presumably knowing she was definitely going to lose?
I don't know whether she knew it or not. None of us will ever know whether she knew it or not.
That's why I said presumably.
But it was an atonement. And I would say that the emergency was a blot on our democracy. There's no other way. When you lock up opposition politicians, when you censor the press, and when you find yourself essentially imposing your government's untrammeled control, including that of your son, who has no particular constitutional office in the country. Forget constitutional, even unconstitutional office in the country. He was just her son. And he was calling the shots, giving orders to government bureaucrats, secretaries, ministers. That was really a blot on our democracy. And it was seen as such at the time. I had just gone abroad for my graduate school, and I was hearing about this in great detail because I roomed with a journalist who was bringing me sort of telex stories that were much more detailed than anything you could read in the published media. And it was an awful situation. I might add that Mrs. Gandhi then, by holding a free election, and equally important, by respecting the verdict, by stepping aside gracefully when she lost the election, because there was no attempt made to suborn the process.
Well, let's not get into that. There are accounts that suggest that there was an attempt made, but let's not get into that.
There's really no evidence for it. Now, I've read those accounts. They're completely unsupported by any worthwhile evidence. The fact is, she did hand over power. The fact is, she stayed active in politics, fought for her beliefs, and came back to power 3 years later. And to my mind, these are not things we can afford to forget. Our democracy was in the end reinforced and strengthened by the setback of the emergency. And you know that the freedom of the press after 1977 March was of an order of magnitude different from the press that existed before 75. I was a very press-conscious child because my father worked in a newspaper, and I knew a heck of a lot of editors and journalists growing up. And I've seen sort of the complacency and the complaisance, as the French would say, with the system, where half the stories that they would gossip about at cocktail parties or dinners, they didn't put in print because it's just not done, old boy. Those days were gone, and we had a robust free press from 77, which I think we owe to the emergency
so
as well.
India was a better country after the emergency experience, and perhaps because we were distancing ourselves and correcting what we'd done earlier.
Exactly. You don't really value something enough until you've lost it. And when you lost your freedoms, you lost all the things you took for granted, the ability to talk. People were afraid to talk in public places, to journalists, to others, to say things that they couldn't agree with. All of that taught people this is too precious to lose.
Let's jump to 2014. To what extent do you agree with the view that India's political trajectory has changed fairly dramatically with Narendra Modi's election? Majoritarian anti-Muslim trends and forces seem to have come to the fore, and there's an enhanced stress on Hindutva nationalism. To what extent is that a break with the past? To what extent is that comment prejudiced?
No, it's a dramatic break with the past, Karan. Look, I grew up in an India where we were constantly exhorted to celebrate and value the coexistence of people of different faiths, different regions, different languages, and above all, of course, the different religions. And what is more, the government and every person in official authority encouraged us and exhorted us to do more of this. For example, the story, the illustration of this is entertainment tax. You know, you would waive entertainment tax, governments would waive entertainment tax on films like Amar Akbar Antony, which had, you know, 3 toddlers separated in infancy, one brought up by a Muslim, one by a Christian family, one by a Hindu, and then at the end they come together, they defeat the bad guys and discover their relationship. That was widely hailed as embodying the principle of national integration. Today, we have an India where not only is harmony amongst religions not valued, but that people in positions of authority are actively devaluing it. No one talks about national integration anymore. My big fear is of national disintegration. And as for entertainment tax, it's weighed on a film like the Kashmir Files, which ends with the many members of the audience baying for Muslim blood after seeing it. So you've got a very, very different prevailing culture. So it's not just that India has changed, which is too simplistic a statement, but that what is the prevailing ethos, the dominant value system, has been changed from the top. And it's had an insidious effect throughout, particularly northern India, Karan. The kinds of conversations that people wouldn't even dare to have behind the closed doors of a living room are now being declaimed from political podiums and platforms as if they were perfectly acceptable to say. Bigotry has become acceptable, whereas it was beyond the pale in the old India.
Then let me ask you this. Would Mahatma Gandhi be appalled that at a Dharm Sansad in Hardwar in December, there were calls for the genocide of Muslims? Would he be appalled when priests or people claiming to be priests in saffron robes are threatening to rape Muslim women? Or would he say to himself, people have a right to say what they want?
No. Mahatma Gandhi gave his life for Hindu-Muslim unity. He has spoken up throughout for the vital importance of keeping India united, particularly in the face of a very major Hindu-Muslim divide at that time. Today, with an 80% Hindu majority, and I'm afraid a cowed and largely underprivileged Muslim minority, he would consider this appalling. He would not just be ashamed, he would be angered. I could imagine him fasting against it. I can imagine him taking out a march against it. Look at what he did when in those last years of his life, when the country was being torn asunder by partition.
Let me put an opposite view to you. There is an argument that Nehruvian India, with its emphasis on secularism, non-alignment, socialism and parliamentary debate, was not as deeply rooted in India's soil as Modi's Hindutva majoritarianism, his nationalism, his stress on private enterprise, and his unbelievably large popular appeal. How do you respond to that view?
I don't accept that. I think the problem or the curious thing about India is that both are equally rooted in our soil. Look, frankly, probably in every society, it's very easy to stoke up bigotry and prejudice. There are very many supposedly super sophisticated civilized places. Germany in the 1930s, people were able to bring out biases that may have been lurking beneath the surface, but behind a rather long-lasting veneer of sophistication, and suddenly, when stoked by politicians, it came up and it resulted in the butchery of 6 million people.
I'm not saying that that's going to happen. Are you suggesting that these tendencies were always there, that Nehru and India suppressed them?
I believe in every society lurks prejudice, bigotry and hatred, but also lurks a capacity for decency, compassion, and so on, which you officially encourage, which you give more importance to, which you highlight and hold up as an example, is a mark of what kind of society and civilization you are and seek to be. The problem today is, unfortunately, that what we are seeing much more of is encouragement for division, for bigotry, for unpleasantness, rather than what used to be the prevailing ethos of our political and our social system. Now, I do want to say, Karan, that as far as I'm concerned, it's not irreversible. I believe sincerely that we can and must, for our own survival as a nation, turn a corner from the way we've been going over the last couple of years.
Except that coinciding with this development has also been the collapse of Congress as a political power. Does this also mean that the values Congress stood for, liberalism, tolerance, secularism, but also the public sector non-alignment, no longer count and matter? Has India moved on, and are those part of the past?
No, look, I mean, I think, liberalism, tolerance, secularism are not the only things Congress has stood for, but they're fundamental to what the Congress is all about. And I'd like to think that when you speak in terms of the collapse of the Congress, that you're talking about a temporary process, and that can be transformed once again into a revival of the Congress. And these ideas, which still have a great appeal, can once again be brought to the forefront. Don't ever forget the BJP has won 2 elections with 31 and 37% of the vote. The majority of the Indian electorate has not yet subscribed to the Hindutva agenda. And even in that first victory, a lot of it can be ascribed to Mr. Modi's very effective campaign for economic development, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, and so on. In fact, for me, it remains a mystery why Mr. Modi, secure in his majority, hasn't gone back to that message. That's where he can actually win over the allegiance of people who have nothing but contempt for the bigotry that's been unleashed in the last few years.
Let's move away from politics. There's a lot else about India that I want to touch on.
Sure.
India has today an Adivasi president, and we're very proud of that. We've had Dalit presidents before that.
2 of them, yeah.
But you know as well as I do that the truth is India's scheduled castes and scheduled tribes remain amongst the most deprived people in our population. That's right. Have we really made a proper effort to wipe away their tears as Mahatma Gandhi would have wanted his country to do?
I'd like to think we've made an effort, but it hasn't gone nearly far enough. In fact, I've been reading some books on the Dalit situation in India because I've just completed the draft of a manuscript of a biography of Dr. Ambedkar. And many Dalit scholars have concluded from their own research and work and their own life experiences that though there is much to admire in what Ambedkar has done, the Dalit cause has not benefited as much as many hoped at the time that he drafted the Constitution.
Is this one of India's failures?
Look, it's an ongoing story. Nothing is a permanent failure. I would say that it is one of those examples of underachievement which needs to be addressed.
Shashi, 75 years after independence, we still read in newspaper stories about OBC children not eating food because it's cooked by a Dalit cook.
Correct. Dalit
Should we be ashamed that that is the situation 75 years after we began ruling ourselves? That's why I ask, is this one of our failures?
But we're trying to undo 3,000 years of discrimination in 75 years. I'm not saying it should take 3,000, but I am saying that we have to make allowances for how deeply entrenched some of these prejudices and social practices have been, particularly in sort of, to use an unfortunate word, the more backward parts.
Is this understandable that we haven't been able to eradicate caste,
eradicate
untouchability?
It's disappointing. And the truth is, as I said, caste consciousness actually increased for political mobilization purposes. And part of that is also included, I'm afraid, in increasing consciousness of caste differences.
India today, and the government in particular, like to boast of ourselves as a Vishwa Guru. But the truth is, we were a highly internationally acclaimed and recognized country under Jawaharlal Nehru. So the question is this: how different is the international image of India today compared to what it was, say, in 50, 52, 55, 56?
In the 50s, we had a stature we've never approached since. There wasn't a global crisis on which people didn't turn to India. Laos, Cambodia, Suez, Hungary. The first thing people looked to was what would India say or do.
Only yesterday, Amit Shah says that the world doesn't decide on an issue without first hearing Narendra Modi's views.
Well, I'd like to think as an Indian that just might be true, but I find it very, very sort of credulity stretching. Let me say very clearly that the kind of stature we had, we were the first country in the so-called developing world to be decolonized, to be free. We had a very distinctive and original point of view. We didn't subscribe to either of the two blocks in the world at that time. And Nehruji's personal stature meant that he had admirers in every corner of the world. I mean, when he intervened and helped resolve the Suez crisis, there were Pakistani poets writing absolutely laudatory encomia to Nehru, and this was less than 10 years after partition. So let me say that the kind of stature that India under Nehru had, someone like Krishna Menon, resolving crises far, far away from Indian shores. An American U-2 gets shot down, pilots captured by China. Who do they turn to? The Americans can't talk to China because they don't recognize the Chinese government.
Was higher.
The UN Secretary General couldn't help because China wasn't a member of the UN. Both the UN and the US turned to India to get those American pilots off, and we prevent the possibility of an American bombing of China.
So are you saying we were a Vishwa Guru then more than we are a Vishwa Guru now?
Far more. farmer. Today we are absent from pretty much every major crisis. We're playing no role in the Middle East, which we did in those days. We're playing no role even in Afghanistan, which is practically next door to us, whereas we were playing roles in countries far, far away from us. And we have, I'm sorry to say, a long way to go before people will look upon us with respect, because we're getting a very bad press in the world right now for our domestic circumstance.
Narendra Modi has been Prime Minister of India for 8 years. He has at least 2 more ahead of him, very possibly 5 more after that. I'm asking you this now as a historian. Do you have any sense of how history will remember Narendra Modi?
Look, it's still a work in progress. I think it's, I wrote a book about most of his first term called The Paradoxical Prime Minister, and there are paradoxes. There are many things that impress the outside observers about him. In particular, I would say he has an uncanny finger on the pulse of at least of the Hindi-speaking Indian people. He's quite brilliant at the way in which he's able to reach out to them, understand their needs and their prejudices as well, and cater to what they want to hear from him. And he has got a good sense of diagnosis.
Is he better at that than any other previous Prime Minister, at understanding the Indian people?
Understanding, as I say, the North Indian people. I don't think he's still got it right for the whole of India. But the land of Aryavrat, the Hindi-speaking belt, as it were, I think is eating out of Mr. Modi's hands.
And he understands them better than any of his predecessors.
I would say so, yes. Well, we haven't all lived as adults through the rules of the periods of Nehru and Indira Gandhi and so on, and perhaps one might say something similar about them too. But I would say that with Nehru there was more a vision shaped by a consciousness of global and historical forces. With Modi, there's much more a sort of finger on the pulse, what the Germans call a Fingerspitzengefühl for the way in which Indians think. But I say, limited in my view to a part of India that is the North Indian Hindi-speaking area, which is, of course, the majority of our population. Now, having said that, it's also true that Mr. Modi is working on a number of things that could amount one day to a significant accomplishment. The work he's doing in India's technology development, the so-called tech stack, could yet transform India in a way that would both help the entry of our Indian citizens into the 21st century and become something that makes India a model for the rest of the world. If he achieves that and pulls it off, I think that will be an important contribution that history will reward him for. Similarly, he could still do a U-turn on this absolute nasty toxicity of hatred and bigotry that is being spread by the people associated with the ruling party.
What makes you believe he could do a U-turn beyond the theoretical possibility he could?
No, it's not just a theoretical possibility. I'll give you one interesting example is what happened on the so-called Nupur Sharma example. Mr. Modi has actually worked very hard to strengthen relationships with the Gulf countries. I would argue that he's done a better job, perhaps, than we had done in cultivating that relationship. Of course, at a more propitious time. We were in power at a time when the Gulf was much more inclined towards the Pakistanis on some of the issues dividing us. Today, they're very conscious of their own vulnerability to Islamic terrorism. They are not wanting to encourage people who play footsie with militants. But Mr. Modi has seized that opportunity and we have very good relations with the Gulf. And this episode taught him that when you have people foaming at the mouth in India, it has repercussions for his global strategies and for India's real geopolitical interests in our own backyard. So he may realize it's not in his interest to let this get out of hand, and he will realize that the day he's convinced that he doesn't need it in order to come back to power. It's all a game of political polarization. It's about doing these things in order to get re-elected. If he says, I can get re-elected without having to demonize a minority, I don't need to do it anymore. Let me just be lovey-dovey to them, and let's focus on other successes.
We're coming to the end of this interview.
So anyway, it's at the end of his career that we'll judge how history will judge him.
Absolutely. But nonetheless, judgments are also made after 8 years, because 8 years is an appreciably long time in power. And I wanted to ask you, as a historian who's written about the Prime Minister, what you think will be history's view of him. And the answer you've given me is that actually we can't say for certain today.
It's a work in progress. And I think it could go either way. He could end up, unfortunately, accentuating the worst tendencies that have been unleashed during his reign, or he could end up hopefully marginalizing those tendencies and accentuating some of the remarkable progress that seems to be made on areas like technology, where we can perhaps still become a world leader.
We're coming to the end of this interview, and I want to ask you a personal question. Do you, Shashi Tharoor, like the sort of country India is becoming?
I don't like the thought of India becoming more and more a comfortable place for bigotry. That's not the India that I grew up in. I had, I was a child of parents who came of age during those nationalist years of the 30s and 40s, and I mean, I had friends of every conceivable caste, religion, creed coming and playing at home. My parents never mentioned once that so-and-so is a Muslim, or so-and-so is a Sikh, or so-and-so is whatever else. It was much, much later that I even realized the astonishing diversity of backgrounds of people who had been my friends and classmates and who I'm still in touch with for the most part.
So
Now,
are you saying you don't like the change that's happening in front of your eyes?
In front of my eyes, I'm seeing in India. I mean, I've heard stories of children being told, my parents say we can't play with you because you're a Muslim. Little children 6, 7, 8 years old. It's tragic. I hear very, very sad stories of a UN official telling me how in a tense negotiation with a bearded militant, what should have been a calling card that would have worked in his favor even 5 years ago, that he's from India, is now turned against him. We know how you treat Muslims in your country. Get out of here, or we won't be responsible for the consequences. I heard stories of people who you've been, for example, coming to India regularly, trading in jewelry and handicrafts and so on, and who, when they mentioned what their name was, a Muslim named Noor, people would say, what a lovely name, we know what it means, and so on. Now, when she says, my name is Noor, people say to her, oh, Muslim. That's the change in mentality that I find absolutely abhorrent.
So you don't like this India?
I don't like these aspects of India. I like other aspects of India. I like our development. I like our technology. I like our ability to actually transform ourselves. I like the unicorns that are coming into being. I like the young people's drive and aspiration and desire for change and progress. All of that is good, and I want that to be unleashed. I want it to progress. And I want to see all that happening. But I want to see it happening in a country where people genuinely care for each other, respect each other, learn to accept the differences.
And there is no religious bigotry.
And learn to accept the differences
and
with
Muslims
respect.
are not othered.
Exactly.
My last question. For failing to stand up adequately, or perhaps I should say sometimes for failing to stand up at all, for the ideals and principles of our Constitution, who do you blame most? Parliament, the Election Commission, the judiciary, the media, or the Indian middle class, which seems to be increasingly enamored of the India that's emerging?
We have to blame all of the above. All of us. I think every one of us is equally complicit for perhaps not having done more than we actually have tried to do to correct these tendencies. But I would say that if we were to look at our own professions, you in the media have been astonishingly, I don't mean you personally, I mean the media as a profession, has been astonishingly quiescent of late. The famous line of Mr. Advani about the emergency, that when you were asked to bend, you chose to crawl. Here you weren't even asked to bend. The media has been crawling in the most appallingly craven manner for the last few years. And it's often got to do not with perhaps the media themselves, but with the blatant pressures on the owners of the media, which we've seen through the extraordinary misuse of IT and ED and other institutions. And as far as the political class is concerned, we have been feckless as well. We have failed to see the dangers. We've failed to unite where we needed to. We've allowed ego and other petty things to come in the way. We have missed opportunities, for example, to showcase to the nation a better model, an alternative model of Indian growth and governance. And even when we're sort of wasting a session of Parliament in disruption rather than in debate, we aren't doing ourselves any favors. And that's just for our two professions. Every other institution you mentioned, I'm afraid, is equally compromised.
So we're all to blame for the bigotry, for the polarization that seems to be increasingly spreading in our country.
I'm afraid so. I mean, the thing is, I don't want to, again, generalize totally, because I live and work in the South, where polarization and bigotry is of a totally different and much lower order of magnitude than what you're living with here in Delhi and in the North. So we still have hope. I still am proud to say that a Muslim walks around in Kerala without a sense of being a minority.
South India provides the hope for a better future.
I hope the rest of India will become a little more like Kerala, yeah.
But South India provides that beacon of hope today.
Absolutely. It sets an example, which I hope the rest of India will follow.
Shashi Tharoor, thank you very much.
Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.